Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house to make a courtesy check that cell phones have been muted as we prepare to begin. It is always appreciated. And, of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments throughout the presentation, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post the program on our homepage for everyone's future reference. Hosting our discussion today is Dr. Peter Brooks. Dr. Brooks is a Senior Fellow for National Security Affairs here at Heritage. Prior to joining us, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration, on the Republican staff of the Committee on International Relations in the U.S. House of Representatives. He worked with the Central Intelligence Agency as well as at the State Department, in the private sector at defense firms, and on active duty in the U.S. Navy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Brooks.
Thank you, John. I guess it's good afternoon now. And welcome to the Heritage Foundation, our discussion on the Iranian nuclear negotiations. Well, I guess a deadline, like a red line, is a deadline except when it isn't. It seems we've blown through another quote-unquote deadline with Iran in the latest round of nuclear talks. News reports from Vienna this morning indicate that there are still a number of rough patches on the road to an agreement between Iran and the P5+1, and the talks will go until the end of the week, maybe. These include hot-button issues such as sanctions relief for Iran, research and development, the inspection and verification regime, and the question about Iran's prior work on a nuclear warhead, among others. To complicate matters further, Iran is pushing for punitive economic sanctions to be lifted on their ballistic missile program, in addition to the sanctions placed on Tehran due to its nuclear transgressions. As if that isn't enough, Tehran is also asking for an end to weapons embargo put on Iran, which is deeply troubling considering its support for terrorist groups like Hezbollah, the Syrian regime, and its regional aspirations. Since the talks didn't reach an agreement by Tuesday, current legislation requires that Congress get not a 30-day look at the deal, if they reach one, but 60 days instead for briefings and hearings before the pact can be implemented by the administration. Of course, getting a nuclear deal with Iran doesn't address the plenitude of other problems we have with Tehran, including its Middle East meddling and its sponsorship of international terrorism. There's a good reason to be alarmed that the deal we'll get in Vienna will be a bad deal, especially if the United States and its partners cave to Iran to close the deal. To investigate this further, we've joined today by the Hudson Institute's Michael Doran, former Undersecretary of State Ambassador Robert Joseph, and the Heritage Foundation's Jim Phillips, to look at the risks, rewards, or ruin that might come from an agreement in Vienna with Iran. Let me introduce the panelists in some more detail before we get started, as our time is limited today. Ambassador Robert Joseph holds a position of Senior Scholar at the National Institute for Public Policy. Until March 2007, Ambassador Joseph was Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. From 2001 to 2004, Dr. Joseph served on the National Security Council as a Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Proliferation Strategy, Counterproliferation, and Homeland Defense. 1992 to 2001, he was a Professor of National Security Studies and Director and Founder of the Center for Counterproliferation Research at the National Defense University. Earlier, he was Commissioner to the Standing Consultative Commission, Ambassador to the U.S.-Russian Commission on Nuclear Testing, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces, Arms Control Policy, Nuclear Policy, and Planning Officer at the U.S. Mission at NATO. He was also an Assistant Professor of International Relations, Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tulane University, and Carleton College. Jim Phillips is the Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He is a veteran foreign policy specialist who has written widely on Iran, Middle Eastern security issues, and international terrorism since 1978. He is a former research fellow at the Congressional Research Service at the Library of Congress and a former joint doctoral research fellow at the East-West Center. Jim has testified many times before Congress on Middle East security issues, including the Arab-Israeli conflict, Middle Eastern terrorism, and the Iranian nuclear issue. Michael Doran is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he specializes in Middle East security issues. In the administration of President George W. Bush, Doran served in the White House as a senior director in the National Security Council, responsible for Middle East issues, including Arab-Israeli relations and U.S. efforts to contain Iran and Syria. He also served in the Bush administration as senior advisor at the State Department and as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon. Before coming to Hudson, Mike was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's also held teaching positions at NYU, Princeton, and the University of Central Florida. Clearly an impressive group to speak about today's topic. Ambassador Joseph, can you start us off? You can either do it from there or come to the podium, whichever you wish.
Okay, why don't I just stay right here?
All right.
Good afternoon. It's always great to be back here at Heritage. So let me first thank the organizers for the invitation to speak here today on the very timely topic of Iran and the nuclear negotiations. I have been speaking and writing on this subject for more than 2 years and have watched our negotiating position evolve. I will use that word, a very kind word, evolve in one direction. For this has not been a matter of compromise, the give and take of normal diplomatic negotiations. This is a matter of concession after concession on both the major and minor issues being negotiated. Since the JPOA was announced in November of 2013, I think the outcome was very clear, whether or not there is an agreement. The outcome is clear. Iran would be recognized and accepted as a nuclear weapons threshold state. And of course, Iran's ballistic missile force, the largest and most sophisticated in the region, would not be limited in any way. These were explicit concessions acknowledged by the White House, but explained away, often in the most convoluted fashion. No longer would Iran be compelled to abandon its enrichment program. It would only be constrained so as to extend the breakout time for the mullahs to build the bomb that they could then deliver on a ballistic missile. And these constraints would be removed after the agreement expires. In the subsequent rounds of nuclear talks, other concessions on key issues have been signaled in the media by Secretary Kerry and by other named and anonymous administration sources, most often through friendly reporters. You're all likely very familiar with most of these, relegating what the IAEA calls possible military activities to an implementation detail, now the responsibility of the IAEA, who Iran, of course, has been stonewalling for years on these issues. No longer would Iran have to come clean on these activities before an agreement goes into effect. But remember, Mr. Amano, the head of the IAEA, described these 12 weaponization activities as alarming. Abandoning the demand for unfettered anywhere, anytime inspections, once considered essential for effective verification. Instead, we will now have managed access and a dispute resolution mechanism that will allow Iran to delay inspections of suspect sites and permit Russia and China to obstruct action in the Security Council. The phasing of sanctions relief and the so-called snapback provisions that the administration once emphasized as a guard against Iranian cheating have been shown to be more words than substance. The president himself has talked about a huge signing bonus, some say up to $150 billion, and Moscow has been very direct. There will be no automatic reimposition of sanctions. I could go on, but let me just say that I long concluded ago that the only real barrier to an agreement is the willingness of Iran to take yes for an answer. Yes, the Iranians will agree to certain conditions, such as not building buildings that they have never intended to build. Instead of no enrichment, Iran will be limited to operating 5,000 or 6,000 centrifuges under the agreement, but they will also be allowed to maintain in storage thousands of other machines that could be brought online relatively quickly. And R&D and building ever more advanced centrifuges will go on. Yes, it is better that these centrifuges are not being connected during the tenure of the agreement, but that doesn't make this a good deal. In fact, this is unquestionably, based on what we know, a bad deal. And this important distinction often gets lost in the rhetoric. Everyone wants a negotiated outcome, including, and perhaps more than anyone else, Israel's leaders. Polls cited by the administration do show that a large majority of Americans want a diplomatic outcome. Of course they do. But the next question is, would the same majority support a bad deal? And I think the likely answer is a resounding no. So what are the metrics to judge the outcome, to judge whether this is a good or bad deal? I think they're rather straightforward when you think about it. Here are 5. Does the agreement deny Iran a nuclear weapons capability? The long-standing, declared goal of the United States and the international community. Does the agreement, once the constraints expire, prevent Iran from building a nuclear weapon in a short amount of time? Does the agreement actually extend the breakout time in a meaningful way? Is the agreement effectively verifiable? And is there a meaningful phased relief of sanctions, and are there guaranteed snapback provisions? And I think very clearly the answer to each of these questions is no, a reality that's becoming apparent across party lines. So how did we get into this mess? And have no doubt this is a mess. I think the answer is very clear. The administration has violated every rule of negotiating practice, the basic tenets of negotiating 101. Instead of increasing pressure on Tehran through more sanctions, they relieved sanctions to, in their words, keep Iran at the table. But remember, it was these very sanctions that brought them to the table. Instead of making clear to Iran that Iran needed an agreement more than we, the administration has demonstrated just the opposite, that it is desperate for an agreement. A desperation that Iran's negotiators have exploited to the fullest, as seen even today in the demand for ending the arms embargo. Instead of insisting on full compliance with the interim JPOA, the administration has in effect become Iran's advocate and lawyer, reinterpreting the provisions of the agreement to keep the negotiations going. Instead of insisting that the word deadline means deadline, the administration has allowed Iran to squeeze further concessions each time the latest deadline approaches and then passes. And most important, instead of holding the line on those key issues that would actually determine whether the agreement is good or bad, whether it advances U.S. security interests or undermines them, the administration has made concession after concession, and the consequences are profound. Any agreement that allows Iran to continue to build its ballistic missile force while simultaneously permitting Iran to maintain, if not expand, its nuclear capability, will undermine U.S. national security interests, as well as those of our friends and allies in the region and beyond. Iran will almost certainly become the preeminent power in the Gulf. With the U.S. pullout from Iraq and the drawdown from Afghanistan, there will be few who will oppose Iran's further expansion effectively. In the past decade, Iran's menacing, malevolent presence has grown in Syria and Lebanon, and more recently in Iraq and Yemen. The administration's suggestion that a nuclear deal will lead to a more moderate Iran is sheer fantasy. All you have to do is listen to what the Iranians are saying. For me, personally, because I approach these issues from a non-proliferation perspective, another strategic consequence of a bad agreement is the increased prospect for nuclear proliferation. One likely result of Iran's greater capacities and influence, reinforced by a growing skepticism among our allies about the U.S. ability and resolve to defend their interests, will be decisions by other Gulf states to acquire a nuclear threshold capability similar to Iran's. Saudi Arabia has already said openly that it will seek what Iran is permitted. And how can we then say no to the Saudis and to others who want to enrich or perhaps even reprocess after giving Iran the stamp of approval? In other words, the administration has undercut one of the most important non-proliferation tools dating back to the Carter administration. Finally, because the United States and other P5+1 members have agreed to exclude ballistic missiles from the negotiations, the message to other rogue states will be that we are not serious about imposing costs for missile proliferation. This could further increase the incentives for states seeking weapons of mass destruction to acquire ballistic missiles as a means of delivery. For Iran, it could encourage even closer cooperation with North Korea on the transfer of missile technology and perhaps nuclear weapons technologies as well. With tens of billions of dollars in sanctions relief, Iran's military and its Revolutionary Guards will have access to more resources, for more missiles, for more weapons across the spectrum, and for more terrorist activities. A bad agreement will result in a less stable and less safe world for the regional states, for Israel, and for the United States. Let me conclude by saying that one didn't need to be prescient to know even 2 years ago how this was going to turn out. The administration still clings to the old talking points. You've heard them in the last couple days, that it will not accept a bad deal, that it will walk away if Iran doesn't meet its demands, and of course, that no one yet knows how this will turn out because nothing is agreed until all is agreed. But let me say, in my view, if you find these statements credible, given all that we do know, I think you're living in the bizarro world. In fact, for me, I long ago concluded, really quite sadly, that the supreme leader was less likely to distort the status of the negotiations to his public than the White House was to the American public. The American people, as President Obama has said, deserve the truth. Let's ensure that they get it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Jim?
The emerging nuclear deal with Iran has significant flaws and risks that could dangerously undermine U.S. national security, either directly in terms of the nuclear technologies and capacities that deal grants Iran, or indirectly in terms of the regional implications to the deal. And I like to focus my comments primarily on the regional implications and getting into a little way of how some of our allies in the region look at this deal. Although the administration entered the negotiations pledging that this negotiation would cut off the path of Iran towards a nuclear weapon, it's become clear that this is little more than a diplomatic speed bump that will only delay, if not give Iran opportunities to cheat on a whole new set of arrangements. The agreement, in effect, legitimizes Iran as a threshold nuclear power, and once the restrictions on Iran's nuclear activities expire, it will be easier for Iran to cross that threshold. Iran's nuclear infrastructure is left largely intact, and it's well on its way to developing an industrial uranium enrichment capacity that will shorten its sprint for a nuclear weapon. This fact is not lost on our allies, our friends, or frenemies in the region, who are likely to hedge their bets and take out insurance by working to expand their own nuclear options. The end result could be an accelerated nuclear proliferation and a possible nuclear arms race in the most volatile region in the world today. Iran's neighbors see that the prospective deal would allow Iran to maintain a huge infrastructure that far exceeds its legitimate civilian needs, that include nuclear facilities built in violation of Iran's nuclear proliferation commitments. And this deal would, in effect, legitimize these illicit operations while imposing very few penalties on Iran. And as the ambassador said, that sets up a very dangerous situation for potential proliferators in the future. Incredibly, the administration is offering the Ayatollahs in Iran today uranium enrichment arrangements that it denied to the Shah of Iran under the Ford and Carter administrations back in the 1970s. For more than 5 decades, Washington has opposed the spread of sensitive nuclear technologies, including uranium enrichment, even for its allies. It should not make an exception for Iran, which, by doing so, in effect, it would be conceding the acceptability of an illicit uranium enrichment program in a rogue state and ends up merely haggling over its size and scope. Moreover, Iran can quickly renege on its concessions if the Ayatollahs decide to do so. But sanctions on Iran, especially at the UN, will take time to reimpose, if they can be reimposed at all. And the Russians and Chinese are sure to bring objections if they see it's in their interest to do that. So this snapback provision, I think, is more of a myth than a legitimate institutional arrangement. The elephant in the room that the Obama administration downplays is Iran's long history of violating its previous nuclear agreements. The administration claims that Lausanne Framework Agreement provides for an unprecedented and intrusive inspection regime, but Iran has already walked away from some of those commitments. Moreover, Saddam Hussein's Iraq was subject to much more intrusive inspection arrangements after the 1991 Gulf War, but it frequently blocked and circumvented inspections for 12 years until he was ousted in 2003. The administration has sought to ease the anxieties about verifying Iranian compliance by stressing the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency, but the IAEA only has access to declared nuclear facilities, and it completely missed Iran's covert nuclear program before it was revealed by Iranian opposition groups in 2002. President Obama insists that if Iran cheats, the world will know it. But how long will it take to find out that Iran is cheating? And what will the world do when it discovers that cheating? Look at Syria, which the Obama administration signed a deal with in 2013, trumpeting it as a great non-proliferation agreement in which the Assad regime was supposed to destroy all of its chemical weapons. Yet today, that regime continues to use chlorine gas against its own people with little fear of the consequences. The administration's acceptance of that flawed arrangement and its refusal to enforce its own red lines when confronted with cheating is an extremely alarming precedent, not least for our regional allies who fear a similar dynamic in the Iran deal. The administration's recent actions essentially playing the role of Iran's lawyer in explaining away violations of the interim accord, its failure to convert enriched uranium into the right kind of uranium oxide, as noted in today's Washington Post editorial, is another flashing alarm sign for our allies that will undermine confidence in the U.S. and confidence that it will take strong action if Iran violates the agreement. Another major problem is it's not clear that Iran will be required to come clean on the military dimensions of its nuclear program. PMD and IAEA parlance, and that's important because it's almost impossible to develop a clear picture of the breakout time if you don't know what is the base of Iranian actions from which it's going to break out. The nuclear deal also gives Iran billions of dollars of sanctions relief, an economic shot in the arm that will bolster one of the most hostile and dangerous regimes in the Middle East and boost the threat to the U.S. and its allies. Iran would get $30 to $50 billion signing bonus immediately and would eventually pocket between 100 and 140 billion of its oil revenues frozen in offshore accounts as a result of sanctions. Moreover, Tehran would reap the benefits of greater oil sanctions, of greater oil revenues once the sanctions are lifted. Iran's oil ministry expects that Iran eventually could double its oil exports from about 1.2 million barrels a day today to about 2.3 million barrels a day in the future, and that will give it much greater financial resources to finance terrorism and subversion abroad and its brutal repression at home. The economic payoff of a nuclear deal would also help Iran shift the regional balance of power in its favor and could possibly embolden the regime to become more aggressive in its foreign policy. Allies in the region are also alarmed that Washington has backed off many of its red lines. Those red lines are fading to pink or even pink dotted lines. Meanwhile, Iran is adding new red lines, and Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, last month added a set of red lines that would make a deal impossible. Some have interpreted these pronouncements as a bargaining tactic, but it also could spell, in the long run, I think, the death knell of the talks, because the supreme leader's intervention goes beyond merely good cop, bad cop, and it goes right to the heart of one of the problems with the Iranian regime. The fact that you have a government negotiating with the West that could be at any point overruled, undermined, and just done an end run around by the supreme leader. And it's important to note that he reflects the interests of Iran's revolution, and that tension between the logic of the revolution and the logic of the state has made Iran always a prickly case for negotiating with, and we've seen that time again in trying to negotiate with Iran. And I predict that if there is an agreement signed, that may not be the end of negotiations, because the supreme leader will have undoubtedly new red lines about how to implement the agreement. And I would say that this supreme leader may be so adamantly opposed to any kind of flexibility that a good deal with Iran may be impossible to get until after he's left the stage. From the viewpoint of many U.S. allies and friends in the region, this agreement looks like a looming disaster for their interest. Israel, which is within range of Iran's ballistic missiles, has warned that it reserves the right to launch a preventive strike against Iran's nuclear infrastructure if the agreement fails to give adequate safeguards against Iran attaining a nuclear weapon. Prime Minister Netanyahu has warned that this agreement, rather than barring the path to a nuclear weapon, is really paving that path. And for Israel, this is an existential issue. It's not just a question of building some kind of a political legacy. Former Iranian President Rafsanjani, who is considered a moderate, darkly noted that Israel is a one-bomb country, meaning that it could be destroyed with one nuclear weapon, while Iran is much bigger and can sustain much greater damage. This kind of rhetoric does not bode well for the future. Israelis argue also that the administration has played a strong hand weakly, as the ambassador said, relieving sanctions pressure on Iran, downplaying the military option, and both of these, the effect of both of these is to release pressure on Iran to not only come up with an acceptable agreement, but to come up with any kind of agreement by deadlines, because it's learned time and time again, the more it digs in its heels, the more it's rewarded. And Israel is not alone in criticizing this deal. Saudi Arabia, whose king boycotted the White House summit at Camp David in May as a sign of unhappiness with U.S.-Iran policy, also is unhappy with the trajectory of the nuclear negotiations. And Riyadh has let it be known that it will demand every nuclear concession that Iran receives. And it's entered negotiations with France to build civilian nuclear reactors that could in the future become the basis of a full-fledged nuclear weapons programs. Saudis fear not only the possibility of U.S.-Iranian detente, but an Iranian-American entente that would greatly jeopardize their national interests. So they're hedging their bets, they're seeking better relations with Moscow and Beijing, and they're making plans for their own nuclear program. The United Arab Emirates, South Korea, and Taiwan had greater restrictions put on their enrichment programs than what it looks like Iran will be able to gain, and they may want to renegotiate their arrangements. So this agreement may open the doors to a nuclear arms race, because after restrictions on enrichment are eased, Iran will be in a much better position to make that final sprint. And even if you assume that Iran will not cheat on the agreement, will not build a bomb after the greatest restrictions are eased, prudent governments that fear Iran are bound to take out insurance policies in the form of their own nuclear programs, and this could spur a cascade of proliferation that would include Saudi Arabia, possibly Turkey, Egypt, UAE, maybe Algeria, and that would lead to a multipolar or Middle East with each country on a hair trigger, because they will be lacking secure second strike capability, so they'll be in a use it or lose it situation. So if you think the Middle East is volatile and dangerous now, just wait. Even some former senior officials who were involved in formulating the administration's policy on the Iran nuclear issue last month warned in an open letter organized by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy that an emerging deal may fall short of meeting the administration's own standard of a good agreement. The bottom line is that the Obama administration now has an agreement in principle with the regime that has few principles except to expand its power and export its revolution. This emerging deal already has weakened U.S. alliances with important friends in the region. It's undermined the perceived reliability of the U.S. as an ally. It's reduced U.S. influence and puts Iran in a position to greatly expand its own influence. It weakens longstanding non-proliferation goals, and it could contribute to a very dangerous multipolar Middle East. So the picture is not pretty.
Mike?
Thanks. Thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming. I can't add any happiness and sunshine to this picture. I'll just I'll confine my remarks more to the region, and I'll take up some of the things that Jim said and emphasize them a little bit more. The allies of the United States in the Middle East disagree about many consequential things. But for the last 36 years, there's one thing that they could all agree on, and that is that the United States is the guarantor of regional order. And they have looked to it to play that role, and they have assumed that that role comes with a responsibility, namely organizing, orchestrating the containment of Iran. And as the allies have watched the U.S. negotiate this agreement, I think they have come to the conclusion that the United States, that President Obama has shed this responsibility, that he has taken the United States out of the game of containing Iran. Now, the president doesn't admit that. He continues to talk in those terms. And when he brought everybody to the Camp David summit, the GCC summit here last month, there was a lot of newspaper commentary by supporters of the administration that talked in those terms. I'll get back to that in a minute, though, because I think if you look carefully at what the president said, he has, in fact, gotten out of the Iran containment business. But before I get to that, let me just talk a little bit about the concerns of the allies, what they've been watching, what they've been thinking as they've been watching these negotiations, and then a couple of the arguments that the administration has put out to try to quell the concerns of the allies, and why the allies find these arguments completely unsatisfactory. And then a couple words about the consequences of all this. So I think there are four trends that the allies have seen while watching this negotiation. Trends that my colleagues have already covered pretty well. The first one is American retreat, and the negotiation has been the history of the negotiation has been the history of U.S. concessions, starting with the interim deal itself. The interim deal was traded temporary and reversible concessions by the Iranians for permanent concessions by the U.S. The U.S. agreed to a sunset clause, meaning that this would only be a temporary agreement, and it ceded the right to enrich it. It recognized Iran as a threshold nuclear power, and it did that as the first step. And in return for that massive concession from the U.S., it got an agreement by the Iranians to temporarily reduce the pace of the advance of their program, I mean, just for the life of the negotiation at that point. So that's just one example. We know all of the other other ones that have been mentioned: the PMD issue, the secure facility at Fordo, and on and on and on. Now, as when the allies look at this, it's troubling enough to see the terms of the agreement that result from this capitulation, but the spectacle of the capitulation is equally unnerving, because it makes them wonder if they're in a pinch with respect to Iran, will the United States actually be there at their side? I mean, to watch the United States whittle down its own position on its own vital interests instills you with a feeling that when it comes to your vital interests, they're going to be even more inclined to whittle things down. So it undermines confidence in U.S. resolve. The second issue, the second trend they see, which I've already mentioned, is this conceding permanent concessions for temporary ones by the Iranians, embodied in the sunset clause in the agreement. That's particularly troubling because it's not just what it says about the nuclear question per se. It also says that the United States is out of the business of containing Iran and is now managing its rise. Right? The Sunset Clause says Iran is going to be a nuclear power, and we're going to help manage its rise. So the two things together, the concessions by the U.S. and then the recognition of the inevitable rise of Iran, suggest that the United States is pulling back and Iran is filling the vacuum. This is compounded by the third trend, the unsettling nature of these developments is compounded by the third trend, which is the new normal that we have seen emerge over the last 18 months in relations between the U.S. and Iran. We used to talk about Iran as an enemy. We still kind of pay lip service to that, but we now engage in Iran in a way that one doesn't engage with one's enemies. As Jim and Bob mentioned, we are serving as Iran's lawyer in these negotiations. Rather than holding their feet to the fire, we are coming to their defense against our allies who are criticizing them. So over the last 18 months, we've watched a severe deterioration in relations between the U.S. and Israel, between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. It's been more visible with respect to the Israelis, because Prime Minister Netanyahu has been much more vocal in expressing his concerns about the Iran deal. But all of the Gulf allies, in fact, I think most of the allies of the United States in the region, have exactly the same feelings about this that Prime Minister Netanyahu has. They've just decided to deal with the problem with the problem differently. They've decided to grin and bear it, and to wait the president out, and to be polite. And not openly express their opposition. But if you heard quiet, off-the-record discussions by the leaders of the Gulf states, you would see that they were saying exactly the same thing as the Israelis, which is really remarkable in and of itself. I think actually the greatest achievement of the Obama administration in the Middle East is that it has brought Saudi Arabia and Israel together faster than anyone would have ever thought was possible. This friction with our allies contrasts with the images we see on our screen daily of the smiling Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, with a smiling John Kerry, giving the impression of a new era of friendship between the two countries. The administration insists that this is just an arms control negotiation. It is a negotiation only about the nuclear issue, and it isn't looking to build on this for anything larger, a larger détente or grand bargain or anything else. But we keep hearing credible reports about much wider discussions between Iran and the United States about the Islamic State in Iraq, about stabilizing Syria, about stabilizing Yemen, and so on and so forth. And our allies are left to wonder just how wide is this cooperation? What are the long-term plans of the United States with respect to Iran? Is the United States actually starting to think of Iran as a partner for regional security, and so on? And then that leads to the most important thing at all, which is the lack of response, the total lack of response. The dog that didn't bark in the story of the last 2 or 3 years in the Middle East is the absence of any attempt by the United States to impose costs on Iran for its interventions in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. You try in vain to find the statement out of the White House of concern about what Iran is doing, about the fact that Iran is deploying Iraqi militias in Syria, about what it's doing in Yemen, and so on. That's just even statements, let alone actually actions designed to impose costs. On the contrary, when the Iranians were running sorties in Iraq with their Air Force, and John Kerry was asked about it, he said explicitly it's a good thing. So those kind of statements by the United States lauding intervention by Iran in neighboring countries send shivers down the spine of our traditional allies. Now, a couple words about some of the arguments that the administration is making, and why they're inadequate, and then we'll turn it over for questions. And I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll just hit two quickly. One, actually, I'm going to hit three. Sorry. One is, as Bob mentioned, that the deal itself is going to moderate the regime somehow. That the influx of capital, the development of a mutual dependence between the U.S. and the Iranians is going to change the calculus in Tehran. As Bob said, this really is a bizarro world. There's no reason whatsoever to believe this. The only way you can believe this is if you assume that the rhetoric and action of the Iranians over the last 30 years has absolutely no bearing on what they're going to do tomorrow. And I don't know, in any field or of prediction, where that would actually be the case. When, in the course of human history, has someone got $100 billion at the stroke of a pen and decided that everything that they did up till yesterday was totally wrong and they're going to change course? I don't even think it requires going into any more detail than that. The administration, I think, has come up with these arguments, and it's been arguing lately that. Saying explicitly that they think the Iranians are going to spend all of their new money on butter, not guns, right? Now, what is the evidence? This is a direct quote from senior administration officials. What's the evidence for this? There's no evidence for this, right? It's just they start listing all of the needs of the Iranian people and of the Iranian economy, and since those needs exist, of course that the regime is going to be concerned about them. They are simply just making things up, right? Because they have this obvious fact that Iran is going to get much more powerful. It's going to get much more wealthy very quickly. It's unnerving the allies, and they don't have a good answer as to what to do about it, how to mitigate it. So they've made up an argument that, oh, well, we're certain that the Iranians are going to spend the money on butter, not guns. Recognizing, I presume, that this really is an inadequate argument, the president has now come up with a different one, which is that once the agreement is in place, that will provide a breathing space, and then we will be able to start containing Iran in the region. But that takes me back to my original point, because if you look closely at how he's defining containment, his use of the word and the use of the word by our allies are two totally different things. They're referring to two totally different things. When the allies talk about containment, they're talking about rollback. They're talking about imposing costs, and they are focusing specifically on the subversive activities of the Revolutionary Guards, and specifically on those activities in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Those are the activities that are most threatening to those regimes right now. They want the United States to organize the coalition to oppose those activities. The president has resolutely refused to do this, and he's refused to do this explicitly. What he's doing is instead he offered at the GCC summit, he offered to fast-track arms purchases, to work on interoperable missile defense, to do counterterrorism cooperation, and so on and so forth. So what he is offering in response to the allies' criticisms, he's offering them enhanced conventional deterrence against a conventional attack from the Iranians, and counterterrorism security cooperation of a variety of sorts. None of that meets the actual need that is expressed. It's like a doctor offering heart medicine to a cancer patient, right? It just doesn't begin to address what they're really concerned about. Which takes me back to my original point that what the president is doing quite clearly, actually, is announcing that the United States is out of the containment business as traditionally understood. Now, the results of this are actually dire, but I don't know that we are going to see the direct lines of causality. Because what the Gulf allies, everything that I'm saying has been obvious to the Gulf allies for at least a year, probably longer. And they have drawn their conclusions. And their conclusion is we're just going to go our own way. We're going to do our own thing. We will mention it to the Americans, when at a time and place that suits us. A good example of that is the Saudi intervention in Yemen. The Saudis organized an intervention against the Iranians, against the Houthis, and they informed the United States about it 1 hour before they went in. That was to send a clear signal to President Obama that if you're not going to organize the region against the Iranians, we are. They didn't come with a big public statement of going a separate way from the United States, but anybody that was watching closely could see that. So what it means, to sum up here, is that the United States is now in a kind of what I call a Machiavellian no man's land. Because Machiavelli said that you should be a loyal friend and a vicious enemy. You should take, when there are conflicts involving your allies, you should take a very clear side. If you sit on the fence, then you are distrusted by your friends that don't trust you, and your enemies have contempt for you. And that's where we are. Now, we are big enough and powerful enough that our friends will not express their disloyalty, and even our enemies will sometimes hide the contempt that they have for us. But when it comes down to determining their actions are filled with contempt, and our allies' actions are filled with distrust, which means that we have lost any ability to influence and to shape what's going on in the region, a region that remains vital to the United States, and a region in which, as we can see by watching events, we may find ourselves involved in another major war sometime soon. And when that war starts, we're going to have no alternative other than to use massive unilateral U.S. force, because we don't have allies organized on the ground to meet the threats that are rising up. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists for a very rich and thoughtful and informative discussion about this important issue. Let's move to question and answer. We do have some time. Please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll call on you. We'll bring you a microphone. Stand if you wish. Please give us your name and affiliation as a courtesy to our speakers. If you're with the press, please make that known as well. One question per questioner. Hopefully we'll get a second round of questions. If you have it to a specific person, please let us know, or if it's to the panel in general. Please no commentary, once again, as a courtesy to everybody else here, so we can get in as many questions as possible. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I see one over there. Yeah.
Thank you for your remarks. I'm Emma Louise Leahy with Denton's, and my question is for the panel. So you were speaking about the risk of a proliferation cascade in the region after a deal, and I was just hoping that you could comment on the counter-argument that we've heard that the GCC and other regional powers are more likely to seek technical parity in response to an unsecured Iranian program than in response to one that has been restricted and has stronger inspections. Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
I have thoughts, but Bob, you're probably the biggest expert, aren't you?
Well, I'm certainly willing to go first. I don't know about my expertise. It's a very good question, but it goes to the issue of whether no agreement is better than a bad agreement. And I think President Obama is right when he has repeatedly said that as he moved toward a bad agreement. Look, the Saudis have been most explicit. They have said they are going to have what Iran is permitted, whether or not there is an agreement. So if Iran is constrained in some realistic way, I think that would be good. But the Saudis see this arrangement that's emerging for what it is. There may be a temporary pause in terms of the number of centrifuges being connected. But clearly, Iran is now a threshold state. We've abandoned the goal of denying it a nuclear weapons capability, which was our goal, which was the goal of the international community as registered in multiple UN Security Council resolutions. We've abandoned that, and we've said, no, what we're going to do now is move from 2 months or 3 months breakout time to 12 months. Well, that's a fatally flawed notion, and the Saudis see it for what it is. They see that as fatally flawed. It's flawed, I think, in at least 3 respects. One, how do you know when the clock begins? Unless Iran, of course, decides to break out at a declared facility that has IAEA monitors. But you know, they're not going to do that. And Iran has demonstrated that it's a master of denial and deception. And no one knows that better than the Saudis. They know the Iranians better than we do. Geography has a powerful force, is a powerful force. And our track record of detecting cheating and nuclear proliferation is not very good. Now, the administration can say, we will know when cheating begins. But again, if you look at our experience in this, over and over and over again, we have failed. The most profound, at least some of the most profound intelligence failures have been exactly in this area. Just look very recently at our assessment of whether or not North Korea had an enrichment facility. It took years. And that debate was only resolved when the North Koreans invited an American scientist to come to the enrichment facility and showed it in operation, okay? Point 1, we won't know. We likely won't know, and the Saudis know that. Point 2, even if we did know, suspend all disbelief, even if we know when they start cheating, what's the likely response going to be? It's taken years for us to get to the point, even internally to the US, to declare that Russia is in violation of the INF agreement. Years. It took years to get the IAEA Board of Governors to vote on Iran violating its safeguards agreements. It took even more years for the Security Council to react. So this notion that 12 months is meaningful in the context of a response is simple fallacy. And third, even if you assume that we would know, and even if you assume that the international community, or the United States for that matter, would respond in an effective way, we don't have the baseline knowledge to be able to assess whether that 12 months is credible. We don't know what progress the Iranians have made on weaponization. They've stonewalled us on that. They've stonewalled the IAEA since the November 2011 IAEA report that identified 12 different activities, all associated with possible militarization. So we don't know that. And we don't know, at least I don't know, what the outcome is going to be in terms of the enriched uranium stockpile in Iran. Will it remain in Iran? That is, the enriched uranium beyond the 300 permitted, we've been told 300 permitted kilograms. Is it going to remain in Iran? The Iranians have said no. We've said yes. Well, you choose which one you believe. But we'll see what the outcome is on that. And we also have an open question about what happens to the enriched uranium at 20%. What's going to happen with that? Maybe it'll be resolved in the endgame, but we're told that it hasn't been resolved as of yet, or at least before the last round of negotiations. So for those 3 reasons, all of which the Saudis are aware of, there's no credibility in this notion of extending the breakout time. We're not going to fool the Saudis. We may fool ourselves, and we may fool the American public, okay? But we're not going to fool the Saudis, and we're not going to fool the other Gulf countries. I was in the UAE earlier this year, and let me say, I think, Mike, you're right. I mean, the sense of the United States as having abandoned the region, the lack of credibility of this administration is palpable. They hold us in contempt. They hold American policy in disdain. I mean, let's face it for what it is. That's the message. And our performance in the negotiations is just one sort of measure of that. The other one, I think, was mentioned, and that is, failing to respond to the red line when Assad used CW had a profound effect on the perception of the United States. Abandoning Mubarak in Egypt. You can make arguments either way, but it had a profound effect on how we're perceived. And this is a fertile ground for proliferation. And I think you're going to see it. And I think the real question is, will this lead to the end of the NPT regime, which is, I think, a very important concern.
Okay. Let's go here, and then we'll come over this way. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Hi, Behba Nagabin, American University. This is to Mr. Doran. Okay, you said repeatedly that America's allies are looking at us in contempt and that the Iraqi regime is asking America to intervene with ISIS and not Iran. So what do you say to the facts that in September 2014, al-Abadi went to Tehran and asked Ruhollah to intervene with ISIS? And also to the fact that there has been an overwhelming amount of appreciation and respect for the Lausanne Agreement in Europe, not only with European governments, but with European companies and corporations.
So I'll take the last one first because it's the easiest. Of course, European corporations like the agreement because it's opening up a new market for them. And the Europeans have largely gotten out of the security game. That's our province primarily. But the Germans have a longstanding approach to the problem that is based primarily on their economic interests in Iran. The British have been moving in the German direction for some time, but our policy has speeded that movement. It was put to me very candidly by a conservative French politician last week. The French have been the staunchest on the Iranian nuclear issue in Europe, and they have been trying to put brakes on some of the speed by which we have been making concessions to the Iranians. And this guy came to me and said, basically, we are suckers for having done this. Because now we have irritated the Obama administration, and we are at the back of the line for getting new contracts from the Iranians. The British were a lot smarter. They saw it coming, and so they helped Obama facilitate his policy, and they got themselves at the front of the line for contracts. It's our job to hold the line. That's what we do in the world. That's what we've been doing in the Middle East. And if we're not going to hold the line, everybody else knows that they can't do it alone. So they might as well benefit from it.
But these countries didn't want to put sanctions on Iran in the first place. They did that because America put pressure on
You had
them.
a chance to ask a question. Let him finish, and we'll move on.
With regard to your second question, you didn't exactly characterize what I said correctly. I said that John Kerry thought it was a good thing that the Iranians were intervening in Iraq. I think we should be very, very concerned about that. And I think that when Iraqi politicians show an inclination to invite the Iranians in, we should come down hard on them from the point of view of our own interests. We should also recognize that Iran is subverting Iraq. It now controls the security sector of Shiite Iraq through militias that Abadi himself doesn't control. So we should stand for territorial integrity of Iraq, but also national sovereignty, and we should see Iran as the primary threat to national sovereignty. And one last point, we have to be aware of the effect that this is having on all of our Sunni allies. The administration is suggesting strongly, and its friends are saying explicitly, that Iran can be our ally against the Islamic State. It's simply not true. It's not true on every level. First of all, Iran does not regard the Islamic State as an enemy the way we do and the way our allies do. The Islamic State is a Sunni revolutionary power that's seeking to take power in the Sunni world. It does threaten Iranian interests to a certain degree in southern Iraq. But it also has created tremendous opportunities for Iran to, like I said, to secure its control over Iraqi politics, and also to sell itself to gullible Westerners as an ally against the Islamic State. What we have done by doing that is we have created a polarization in the region where our Sunni allies don't trust us at all, and they think that our war against the Islamic State is simply going to facilitate the rise of Iran throughout the region. As a result, we have a coalition of over 60 partners that can't defeat the Islamic State, which is 20 or 30,000 guys with pickup trucks and bad attitude. Right? Why can't we defeat it? Because they don't really. Our partners don't really want to defeat it. They've signed up just to be polite to us, but they don't really want to defeat it because defeating it means facilitating the Iranian hegemony over the region.
Okay. There's a question up there.
Sure. My name is Matt Tuning, and I'm with Run for America. My question is for the panel. You talked a lot about kind of how we've got a bad negotiating position. How do we get that negotiating position back, and what are some steps we can take to kind of fix our negotiating position and our regional respect? Because I know, obviously, we've taken back some of our sanctions and rolled some of those back, but at the height of the sanctions, what more could we do to put pressure on Iran that wouldn't send them into the open arms of Russia and China?
Well, I would say as a pessimist, I don't think this administration is capable of coming up with, correcting the mistakes it's already made and coming up with a logical and coherent negotiating position that could produce an acceptable agreement. And so I think that puts the onus on the U.S. Congress to take a very close look at what is emerging, because each day it seems like there's a new element that's even worse than what we've heard before. But I think we need to walk away from the table and let economic forces take their course in Iran. And even without the sanctions, the Iranian regime itself has so many bad economic policies and corruption that I think over time political opposition will grow. But I'm not sure that it's possible to really walk this back.
Do you guys have time for one more question, or do you want to say something?
I could just add
Yeah,
very briefly, because
Yeah.
I testified last month and was asked that question, what can Congress do? And I said, well, Congress can do a number of things. First, they can vote no if this is, in fact, a bad agreement. And they will have that opportunity, and I think that's an important expression of sort of the view of the American public that emanates from Congress. I said Congress can also try to ensure, to the degree that it can, that sanctions continue, at least those legislative sanctions that have been imposed on Iran. I said Congress can also establish a Team B, which is a technique that has been used in the past to monitor the implementation of this agreement, so that there are outside experts with access to all the intelligence who can confirm compliance or detect and ensure that non-compliance is detected. And finally, we need to protect the American people. And one of the most important things that we can do is continue to emphasize and to build our missile defense capabilities, because Iran is working on an ICBM, and it will have the capability to have a nuclear weapon, and the United States will be held hostage by Iran in the future. So there were four things that Congress could do.
Can you guys have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, right here then.
Hi, Carl Gallivan. Working off of two statements. One, how did we get into this mess in the beginning? And the U.S. is a guarantor of stability. Looking at things in a broader context outside of the nuclear issue, since we abandoned our obligations under Bretton Woods, we've kind of backed the dollar with the petrodollar. You know, we've kind of needed Iran and Iraq and Libya and everyone else to keep selling their oil for U.S. dollars. Looking away from weapons and towards a strategy for peace, is there any potential for a new global Bretton Woods kind of understanding that would bring economic stability? Because we've kind of weaponized the Western financial system. You know, we can turn people off with a turn of a key, and it creates instability rather than stability.
I'm actually not the best person to talk about it on the economic side because I'll make one
Does
or two
anybody want to
observations.
address it? We can always move on if we don't have the expertise to.
I'm not an
Respond to.
economist, but go ahead and I'll
Just
say
one or two
something.
observations. I don't know if they actually go to your point, but there's a feeling out there. I notice when I talk to groups that because we're on the cusp of oil independence or energy independence, we don't really need the region anymore. And I think that kind of thinking has clearly influenced the White House, even if it's not explicitly in the documents and so on. I think that the events of the last few years, though, have shown that it's simply not true. That we're not ready to give up and leave the region because it has a way of following us wherever we go. I don't think that really answers your question about the economics of it, but I think that we're going to be as guarantors of the global stability and as guarantors of the global economy, and given the fact that this region continues to be the supply of oxygen to the global economy, we're going to be concerned about it whether we want to be or not.
All right, we'll take one more question, last question, I promise.
Thanks. Lou Coffey, Heritage Foundation. My question is based on two assumptions which I think are reasonable. Firstly, we're going to get a bad deal. And secondly, the next administration is going to have to do a lot to shore up U.S. credibility in the region. So assuming that both of those have to take place, what are your thoughts about the U.S. extending a nuclear security guarantee or umbrella among the GCC countries plus Jordan and Egypt as a way to try to stop nuclear proliferation in the region? And I want to stress for clarification, I'm not talking about conventional security guarantee like NATO's Article 5, purely a nuclear one. So if Iran attacks a country with nuclear weapons, then the U.S. would be obligated to respond back. Thanks.
Okay, you want to take that?
Sure. It's not going to work. It's not what they want. They don't want it and they don't believe it. We just passed on the easier part of the equation, which is stopping them from getting a bomb to begin with. And we just showed that we don't have the gumption to go the distance with them on that. So the Allies have drawn the conclusion that we are not willing we're not willing to go the distance with Iran. Why are they suddenly going to be happy with our nuclear guarantee? Do the Saudis really believe that we might trade an American city for Riyadh? If it came to nuclear war, they won't believe the guarantee that we're giving, and they will conclude that the only way that they can force us to pay any attention to them is by developing their own nuclear weapons. By the way, with regard to that point, it's amusing to me as a student. I've done a PhD on Obama administration talking points, and it's very amusing to watch them shift over time. 2 years ago, when during the 2012 election, I guess that's already 3 years ago now, when the concern was the Israeli doubts about the Obama administration's willingness to go the distance with the Iranians. The Obama administration put their surrogates out to say, no, there was a process inside the administration. They looked at this problem carefully, and they came to the conclusion that if they didn't stop the Iranians in a very convincing way, there would be proliferation throughout the region. And President Obama is a non-proliferation hawk. It's something that he regards as one of the most important aspects of his legacy. And so Israelis and Jews in America and supporters of Israel in America, don't worry. President Obama is going to take care of this Iran problem because he knows that if he doesn't, the Saudis will proliferate. right? So Saudi proliferation in the event of a bad deal was a given with respect to the administration up until yesterday. Now that we know the Saudis are really unhappy with the deal, now that the administration talking point is, oh, the Saudis won't proliferate because we're going to give them a nuclear guarantee. It's not going to happen.
Any closing comments, Ambassador or Jim? And then,
Well, I would just say that that's a very important question, I think, for whoever is elected the next president. Let me just say, though, that security guarantees and the nuclear umbrella, the U.S. nuclear umbrella, is perhaps the most important non-proliferation tool that we have. I think we have over 30 countries, friends and allies, who rely on our security guarantee. But this administration has done everything it can to undercut the credibility of the U.S. nuclear deterrent over time. Everything it can. That's now beginning to change because of Russia and President Putin's aggression in Europe, and a realization that Article 5 is very important. And an equal realization that our nuclear forces, our nuclear capability, have deteriorated to such a point that we must act. We must act to do this. And I think we're now beginning to take some of those steps. But again, this is for the next administration to restore our capability and the perception of our resolve. If we fail to do that, I think there will be not just proliferation in the Middle East, but you'll find it around the globe.
Yeah, I would just make 2 points. One, that that kind of a guarantee boils down to credibility, and I don't think this administration has enough credibility left to make that a powerful tool. And I would just say it was no coincidence that Iran reportedly stopped many aspects of its nuclear program in 2003 when it feared a possible military strike by the Bush administration that had overthrown Saddam Hussein to the west of Iran and Taliban to the east. And even Colonel Gaddafi gave up his weapons programs, and he told Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi that was because he expected that if he didn't, that he would suffer the consequences from the Bush administration. And I think the Libya disarmament was an often overlooked victory for the Bush administration that would have had, if it hadn't been done, would have led to much greater consequences in the Libyan civil war. And finally, I would just say that this is an administration that puts a higher priority on engaging its enemies than protecting the interests of its friends. And if you do that long enough, you're going to find more enemies and less friends.
okay. We'll go to Mike and then the Ambassador.
Oh, I just wanted to, I had another thought related to what I said earlier in my remarks. And it's that I think there's a mistake when thinking about the calculations of these countries about nuclear weapons, to think of it as in totally symmetric terms. The Saudi desire, or the desire of other states in the region, to have a nuclear weapon is not simply to deter the Iranians from using their nuclear weapon. The problem with the Iranian nuclear program, when the Saudis and the other Gulfies look at it, is not simply that they're going to have this awesome weapon at their disposal. It's that the United States becomes more deferential to Iran because in every area, because they have this weapon. So there's a way in which it's a kind of bargaining chip with the United States about its policy and its strategy toward the region, the United States and the international community in general, toward the region in general. So the fact that we would give them the security umbrella wouldn't give them the leverage that they want over the Americans, which the Iranians have succeeded in gaining.
Bob?
Yeah, just a final point. Jim mentions Libya. I happened to be involved in the Libya negotiations when they were still secret, and I wrote a book on it in 2009. Very little known book. I think if everyone in this room were to buy a copy, it would triple my sales. But it does, I think, it does show that there is a prospect for good outcomes, for good agreements. What we did is we sailed a ship over to Libya. We loaded that ship with hundreds of metric tons of nuclear equipment, everything that was associated with their nuclear program. And we also loaded on their long-range missiles, and we brought it back to the United States. That was a good outcome, okay? Very clean, very good. Now, Libya, Iran, they're two different cases, just like North Korea is different from Iran. They're all different. But what Libya demonstrated was if we have a strategy that brings together all the tools of statecraft, not just diplomacy, but diplomacy along with economic sanctions, along with the intelligence tools, along with the other instruments that we can bring to bear in a coherent strategy, we can prevail.
Thank you. The panel's done a great job today. They've certainly given us a lot to think about. Thank you all for giving us your valuable time and coming here to Heritage today to talk about this issue. Please join me in thanking them with a round of applause. The panel and program is adjourned. Thanks.